Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be talking about a trend that I have observed, that a lot of people have observed in the great states of Virginia and New Jersey. And that is just to, get right into it here, the apparent revival of Democrats in urban areas, whether that be in Arlington, Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia, in Trenton, New Jersey, in Camden, New Jersey, in Virginia Beach, Virginia, or in Newark, New Jersey. We saw a ton of the most urban counties in these two states swing significantly towards Mikey Sherrill and towards Abigail Spanberger, often by more than the states as a whole swung. So Democrats had a really good night a couple weeks ago in these cities, and the question is now going to be, will this continue in 2026 and 2028? And I'm going to focus in 2026 for this video just because I think it's easier to kind of extrapolate the data we have here to 2026. But in general, what I do think is worth noting is that, and I want to kind of begin my analysis with this and kind of foreground all of the comments I'm going to make here with this, which is that urban areas, I think this is a key part of my not political worldview, but my electoral worldview and my philosophy when I think about elections is that Democrats, especially in the Obama era, and this carried over in 2016 and to an extent 2020, Democrats for the better part of the 21st century have vastly outperformed in urban areas. I've talked a lot about how there's kind of this, in American politics, there's been a broader convergence between, voting patterns and then social beliefs, right? 25 years ago, there were a lot of very conservative people who were culturally and socially conservative in red parts of the country who voted for Al Gore. Those are all Donald Trump voters now, right? Like go to parts of West Virginia or Tennessee or Alabama. A lot of very rural white areas were pretty solid for Al Gore 25 years ago and were very solid for Donald Trump in November 2024, right? And on the flip side, that's why we've seen Republicans do a lot worse in the suburbs, right? George W. Bush and Mitt Romney did really well in a lot of affluent suburban counties that are bigger and more populated. Even though he won in 2024, Donald Trump did not do too well in a lot of those counties. Of course, he did a little better than 2020, maybe in most cases, but he did not do well at all compared to Mitt Romney in, say, Chester County, Pennsylvania, which he lost by, I think, 15 points to Kamala Harris. Then Romney, he won that county by 9 against Obama. So, or excuse me, he narrowly won it against Obama. So, there are a ton of examples of this, but what we've been seeing is that socially conservative voters have moved towards Trump and Republicans, whereas socially liberal voters have moved towards Democrats. In the cities, I think that especially if you look at how Obama and Hillary Clinton did, Democrats were getting higher shares of citywide electorates than I think were socially liberal, right? A good example of this is New York City. Obama did really well in Staten Island and parts of the Bronx, even though I don't think those areas are super socially progressive, right? And a lot of the regression for Kamala Harris, sure, she did worse in Manhattan, but she fell by a lot more in Staten Island and the Bronx than she did in, Midtown Manhattan, as an example. So that's just my broader worldview here, which is that cities are not as socially liberal as their voting patterns suggest. I'm not saying they're conservative. Cities are obviously still the most progressive parts of the country, but that's kind of why I think we're seeing what we've been seeing. So to look at 2025 and get a little more, go a little more granular here. The most important thing to remember with regard to these elections in specific is that these are not low turnout elections. These are not special elections that have 15 to 20% of presidential turnout. These are races. Virginia's race for governor, for example, nearly 3 out of every 4 2024 presidential voters voted in this election, right? Abigail Spanberger got more votes than Donald Trump did here in 2020, and she nearly got as many votes as Trump did in 2024, although it was a little short. So clearly, a lot of people vote in these elections, and that makes them a bit more predictive. Now, there is still a 25% gap, roughly, I think around 23% this year, between presidential turnout at the 100%, and then I think the 76 or 77% of that turnout, which made up the gubernatorial electorate. And I think that drop off, it's been accepted, was probably one that skewed more Republican. I think that by proportion, more Donald Trump voters stayed home than did Kamala Harris voters. Though certainly there were that dynamic was present on both sides, which helped Spanberger win by a little more. But clearly, this is an electorate that is at least somewhat relevant when we think about broader electorates. And maybe you can say that since it's only 3/4 of 2024 turnout, it's not super predictive of 2028. I think it's a little bit predictive of 2028 in the sense that I would say that the electorate itself is predictive, maybe not the actual result, because the result I think was very dependent on specific factors like the government shutdown as one that may not be relevant in 3 years, obviously, right? Think 2021. I think that the electorate in Virginia 2021 with Youngkin was actually pretty relevant. It was, again, roughly three-quarters of the 2020 electorate. It showed a lot of good signs for Republicans that some of them carried over in 2024. But the issues at hand, like education, were not really as big of an issue for Kamala Harris as they were for Terry McAuliffe, right? So that's a qualifier that I want to add. But like what I'm getting at here is pretty simple. It's really that this is a high turnout election. And even if you don't want to think about 2028, you can definitely think about 2026, because in 2021, more people voted in Virginia than 2022. If anything, this could be a higher turnout electorate than the midterm electorate next year. Um, Obviously, 2022, there were no statewide races in Virginia. There was no Senate race, which probably hurt turnout. 2026, there will be. It's going to be Mark Warner again for re-election, right? So that should boost turnout. But like overall, I think the electorate that we saw on November 4th is going to be very similar to the electorate we're going to get next November, which means that this result, this 15% Democratic victory, means a lot. More specifically, I think it shows in the cities, we'll talk about Virginia then New Jersey, what it shows is that Democrats, I do think, have some reason to be optimistic about a revival. Let's look at Arlington, and I did this last time, but like Arlington is a good example of this. Kamala Harris won it by 58 points. Abigail Spanberger, she won it by nearly 70, okay? Right? We saw double-digit swings there. Alexandria, this is a Spanberger plus 66 town, or city, I should say, technically. Harris won it by 58, so we saw an 8-point swing there. Fairfax County, a bit more suburban, but still relevant. Harris by 35. Spanberger took it by, nearly 50, right? So 13-point swing there. And we saw consistently high single digits to low to mid double-digit swings across these areas, right? Another example of this is Manassas Park, which swung towards Spanberger by, I think, nearly 20 points compared to Kamala Harris. So in Northern Virginia, the swings are pretty clear. And again, this isn't limited to Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia is a good example because it's super populated, but like, let's go to other parts of Virginia where we saw similar swings. Let's go to Richmond in specific. Now, this is a pretty blue area. Kamala Harris did do quite well in Richmond, but Spanberger by 73. Okay. Harris, she won it, although not by 73. It was by around 66. And then the one I want to end on, I first going to go down to the Hampton Roads area. Norfolk. This is a Harris plus 42 town that went for city that went for Spanberger by 51. And then Portsmouth, Spanberger won it by 46 after Harris won it by around 39. So the swings are a little bit smaller, a little more marginal in Richmond and Virginia Beach than they were in Nova, but similar. But look at Charlottesville. This is where University of Virginia is. It's a deep blue city. Voted for Spanberger by 78. That is an increase over Harris, who won it, as you can see, by 68. So we saw a double-digit swing in around kind of the grounds of the University of Virginia, and that is really significant because there were actually I think there was one precinct I think on the UVA campus, and there were three on the Virginia Tech campus that actually had higher turnout this year than they did in the presidential year, which is bonkers to think about, right? But that's just what it is. So Democrats, clearly the numbers are there. Clearly they did a lot better. And let's now go to New Jersey before we talk about why this happened, right? Let's compare New Jersey. New Jersey's a little easier because they have bigger counties. But if we look at Sherrod versus Harris, first of all, Passaic County voted for Sherrod by 16. Harris lost it by about 3%. So that's a pretty crazy shift in and of itself. But let's go to Hudson. This is where Newark is. Hudson voted for Sherrod by 51 after only backing Harris by about 28. So like we saw, just there, a 23-point swing towards Mikey Sherrill. Essex is a similar story. It voted for Mikey Sherrill by about 54 after voting for Harris by about 45. So a 9-point swing there. And then, go to Trenton, Mercer County. Swing was a little smaller there, but still Sherrill won it by 43 after Harris won it by 34. And then lastly, Camden County. Harris did okay here, but not great. She won it by around 27. This went to Mikey Sherrill by 37. So, numerically, the trends are consistent that Spanberger and Sherrill outran Harris often by double digits in these urban parts of their states. And so the question is, and New Jersey's similar. New Jersey was roughly, I think, 70 to 75% of 2024 turnouts. This is also an electorate that I think is very similar to the midterms, if not even more high turnout. Okay, so the electorates are relevant. The numbers are consistent. And so what does the question become? Well, the question becomes why? And I think that the answer is actually remarkably similar to what the discussion of these races in their entirety has been. It is turnout. Now, let's think back to what I said at the beginning of the video about my, part of my Ryan theory of everything, okay? Right? The reason that Democrats, and specifically Kamala Harris in 2024, lost so much ground in urban areas was not because, partially it was because Kamala Harris, I think, didn't run a great campaign. But more than the average, I think, person who talks about elections online, I do not, as many of you know, hold a lot of the defeats that Democrats suffered in 2024 against Kamala Harris. I do not think that she had enough time to run that campaign. That's not saying she made plenty of mistakes, right? As most campaigns do. But I'm not here to say that she owns everything that happened in 2024, because quite frankly, I think she owns very little of it compared to Biden and Democrats for the past 4 years. But that's I've made that point many times, right? What I'm really saying here is that I think the swings in Newark that were 25% more for Trump were not only a Kamala Harris thing. I think they were a broader combination of factors. But what I am getting at is that when you compare, when you look at Harris's losses, they came because Democrats had previously been outperforming to a really high and unsustainable extent with socially conservative voters. There were a lot of socially conservative voters, especially Hispanic and Asian voters in Newark, who probably voted for Obama, voted for Trump in 2024. And those voters, who are they, right? They're not super wealthy. They're often middle class. They're often working class. Many of them are blue collar. They often don't have college degrees. And they often aren't super frequent voters, right? Maybe they don't vote in midterms, which is why Democrats held up okay in a lot of these parts of the country in 2022. And maybe they don't respond to polls, right? Which, is part of the Trump factor, right? We always talk about that. Maybe they only vote every 4 years for presidential elections, and that makes them harder to track. And that was why we saw shocking results like Passaic County flipping and like Newark getting 20 points redder in 2024, right? So these voters, they're the trickiest part of this, because I think a lot of them didn't vote in 2025. Now, to be fair, there were precincts and townships where Mikey Sherrod got more raw votes than Kamala Harris. There was some vote switching. There were people who legitimately voted for Trump last year who voted for Mikey Sherrod this time. This is empirically true. I talked about that in my previous video. But nonetheless, a lot of it's turnout. And I think that in the short term, that does benefit Democrats. That's because these electorates are not unfathomably low turnout. It's to the point where they can't be predicted for 2026. Both Virginia and New Jersey 2025 are going to be very similar to Virginia and New Jersey 2026 in the midterms. And they're going to be similar to the country as a whole, where I think that if turnout is 60 to 70% of what it was in 2024, the drop-offs are going to come in the cities, specifically, we're talking about the cities today. They're going to come with, not from Democrats or, consistent down-ballot Democratic voters. They're going to come, I think, from lower propensity, maybe not college-educated voters who switched to Trump in 2024. And that is in part why, even though Trump made a ton of gains last year, we saw those gains reverse and then some. In fact, in a lot of these areas, especially Spanberger and, I honestly, both Sherrod too, but mostly Spanberger, right? We'll talk about Spanberger right here. Spanberger outran, not only did she do a lot better than Kamala Harris, but she did better than Biden in some of these areas. She did better than Mark Warner in some of these areas. And so it's turnout. That's what I think it is. And a lot of people, I think, say turnout is like a buzzword to kind of deny what's happening, which is that, there is some momentum in the favor of Democrats right now. And I think that hasn't been the case in at least a year. Right. So I'm not saying turnout to say that it's an illusion, right? What I'm saying is turnout here clearly shows that Republicans have built a coalition, or at least Trump built a coalition of voters who do not vote every election. And in the cities, when you have these voters that are switching to you, that's great in a presidential year where you can get the base out. But in a governor's race in 2025 or in a Senate race in 2026, it's dicier. So that's something I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to kind of clarify my stance on. It's a fascinating dynamic, and turnout's just so hard to predict and track, so I'm always happy to talk about it. But please let me know what you think. Feel free to comment down below what your thoughts on either of these races are. I'm still thinking a lot about them, even though they've been over the past 2 weeks. It's just so interesting and so much to cover. So thanks so much, and I'll see you all next time.